Unsolved crimes and cases can haunt us for years in an unpredictable world. From a woman being identified who lived her years with a false identity, to a former soldier who got charged with killing a pregnant lady, some incidents remain unexplained and unanswered for decades without an end in sight. However, in 2023, numerous bizarre cold cases were magically solved by some very dedicated people. Police and private detectives are bringing much-needed closure to bereaved families. Join us as we go through 2023's most odd, intriguing, and bizarre events and harrowing accounts of cold cases that were eventually solved decades later. How were they cracked years afterwards, and who decoded them? Without further ado, let's walk onto the edge of the unknown. The case of Mary Agnes Maroney. Mary Agnes Maroney was born on May 9, 1928, to parents Michael and Catherine Maroney. She was soon joined by at least one younger sister, though some sources said she had two. In 1930, 2-year-old Mary Agnes lived with her family in Chicago, Illinois, but the family wasn't doing too well. On May 14th of that year, a woman showed up at her door. She said her name was Julia Otis, and she'd been sent by a social worker named Mrs. Henderson. Julia bought things for them like groceries and baby clothes. She also offered to take Mary Agnes to California, but her parents didn't let her go. The next day, Julia showed up with even more things for the family. She offered to take Mary Agnes clothes shopping, and her parents agreed. They left the house and didn't come back. The next day, the Maroneys received a letter from Julia, saying she'd taken Mary to California and would bring her back in a couple of months. According to IllinoisMissing.org, the letter read as follows: "Please don't be alarmed. I have taken your little girl to California with me. I have hired a special nurse to care for her. We'll be back in 2 months. By that time, you will be on your feet again and will be able to care for her." She didn't even cry a bit. She is outfitted like a princess. In the meantime, I'll help all I can to get you on your feet. Don't worry about her or anything else. When you get this letter, we'll be on our way already. As ever, Julia Otis. Another source said, part of the letter read, "Mary Agnes is on the way to California. You can spare her for 2 months." Regardless of exactly what the letter said, the Maroneys never heard from Julia Otis again. They contacted the police the day they received the letter. About 2 weeks later, the Maroneys received another letter, this one from a woman named Alicia Henderson. One source said she was Julia Otis's aunt, another said her cousin. Either way, she told the family that Julia had lost her husband and child a year earlier, and that she was love-hungry, so she'd taken Mary Agnes. But when police examined the letters, one from Julia Otis, another from Alicia Henderson, they thought the handwriting looked very similar. Because of this, they were afraid Mary Agnes had been killed, presumably by her parents, though it's never been stated explicitly. Michael and Catherine were actually arrested on May 20th, when police couldn't find any trace of Julia Otis, but were let go after an hour. Not much else happened in the case for over 20 years. Then in early 1952, a report ran in the Oakland Tribune in California about the case that included Mary Agnes's picture. A local mechanic named Everett McClelland saw the report and thought the picture looked a lot like his wife, Mary McClelland. 24-year-old Mary McClelland knew she was adopted. Her mother said she had witnessed her birth and adopted her in November 1927, before Mary Agnes Maroney was even born. Her doctor backed her up, saying he'd arranged the adoption in 1927. Mary McClelland also didn't have a scar on her abdomen that Mary Agnes should have had. But other sources say McClelland had been adopted after Mary Agnes disappeared. Anthropologist Dr. Bertram S. Krause examined McClelland's teeth and said there was a match. And when McClelland's fingerprints and blood type were tested, they were found to be similar to the Maroney family, indicating she could be a member. In September 1952, Mary McClelland met up with the Maroney family. Catherine Maroney was skeptical from the start that this was her missing daughter, but they agreed to try and work on a relationship. DNA testing would later prove that Mary McClelland was not Mary Agnes Maroney. She died in 2005. According to a post on an Ancestry.com message board that appears to be started by McClelland's granddaughter, this DNA test happened in 2009. Unsurprisingly, there has been speculation that Julia Otis was a false name. It would make sense, after all. Why would you use your real name in the process of committing a crime? And if Julia changed her own name, she almost certainly changed Mary Agnes's as well. A few people on web sleuths have done some digging and they think they have found either Mary Agnes or Julia, but of course nothing is confirmed. Maroney is now convinced his aunt has been found. He believes Mary Agnes lived her life as Jeanette Burchard, who was raised as an only child, married twice, had 3 children, and spent more than 50 years as a nurse. She died about 20 years ago in Florida at the age of 75. Also convinced is Burchard's granddaughter, Terry Arnold of Florida, who has suddenly found himself entangled in a historic Chicago cold case. Arnold said he was contacted in September 2022 by a Cook County detective who had questions about Arnold's late mother and asked if Arnold would be willing to take a DNA test. She told the Chicago Sun-Times this week that she's since learned my family is completely different from what I've always been led to believe, and she says she's very confident her mother was Mary Agnes. Arnold said her mother loved her pets, opera, and the Miami Dolphins. Her life apparently began in Chicago, but most importantly, Arnold said she was the world's greatest mom. The case of Elsie Baker. A homeowner was excavating for a septic system in 1986 when he unearthed skeletal remains, fabric, and a worn set of dentures in a 4-foot grave, authorities in Oregon said. The grave left a depression on the ground for years before the man found the remains on his property in Grants Pass. The lady had been widely reported on at the time by multiple Oregon news outlets. One story said she disappeared from her home under potentially suspicious circumstances because she had used a wheelchair and couldn't leave without it, but it was found in her home. The story also reported $10,000 missing from her house. When the skeletal remains were first discovered in 1986, they were sent to the Oregon State Medical Examiner's office. An anthropologist determined the remains belonged to a white woman having a living stature, about 63 inches, and that she was older based on her dentures and the degenerative joint disease that was visible on her remains. The anthropologist also said the skeletal remains had been in the grave for 15 to 25 years. But for years, there were no leads on who the remains belonged to. Then in 2018, a DNA bone sample was processed a second time, and a partial STR DNA profile was entered into a national DNA database. A DNA profile was then created in 2020 through DNA phenotyping and investigative genealogy with Parabon Nanolabs. A phenotype report was then made to include eye color, hair color, skin color, and ancestry. By 2022, the genetic geology report narrowed the woman's close relatives ultimately to a family with 6 daughters. All the daughters had a death certificate except one, Baker. Her body had also never been found, investigators said. Investigators then reached out to one of Baker's grandchildren for the last piece in this identification puzzle. A kinship inference testing was taken, and there was a 100% probability they were related. DNA testing identified the remains 37 years later as missing 62-year-old Elsie Marie Baker. Baker vanished from her home sometime shortly after getting cancer treatment, June 13, 1959, authorities said. A nurse told investigators Baker had left the state to live with family, but friends and family never saw her again. Her niece reported her missing in September 1960. Then a news story was published about her disappearance, but the case was only solved decades later. The case of Amanda Gonzalez. Several months into her U.S. Army service in Germany, Private Amanda Gonzalez called her mother back home in Texas and told her that she was pregnant. She was excited and planned to name the child Alicia Marie, her mother Gloria Bates recalled. Bates booked Private Gonzalez a ticket home that Christmas. She never made it. When she did not show up for work as a cook at Fliegerhorst Kaserne, then an army base in Hanau, Germany, on Monday, November 5, 2001, soldiers broke down the door to her third-floor barracks room, her mother said. Private Gonzalez was found dead. Her death was ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. For 2 decades, no one was charged. Frustrated, Bates said she fought to keep the investigation alive, writing letters to members of Congress and to television shows like Dr. Phil and America's Most Wanted. On the 10th anniversary of Private Gonzalez's death, Army investigators offered a $125,000 reward for information, but the case still went cold. Then, 21 years after the killing, Bates said that the FBI called her to say that the authorities had finally made an arrest. According to the Justice Department, Shannon L. Wilkerson, 42, was arrested in Florida and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder in the death of Private Gonzalez, who was 4 months pregnant. Wilkerson faces up to life in prison if convicted. He had been serving in the military when Private Gonzalez was killed and was later discharged from the Army. Wilkerson has pleaded not guilty. Court documents filed in the case did not explain the relationship between Wilkerson and Private Gonzalez, how investigators had connected him to the killing, or any possible motive. A spokeswoman for the U.S. Attorney's Office, for the Northern District of Florida said that the office did not have further details to share. Bates said that investigators told her that they had been examining DNA evidence in the case, although she did not know if DNA had linked Wilkerson to the crime. Bates, who is 60 and lives in Wiley, Texas, said she planned to attend Wilkerson's detention hearing in U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California in Pensacola in March. He was charged under the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which allows the federal government to try former soldiers in civilian courts for crimes that happen overseas. Bates said that her daughter, who grew up in Madisonville, Texas, had been a straight-A student in high school and had wanted to become a physical therapist for children. Private Gonzalez also wanted to travel, so when she got the opportunity to join the Army in 2000 and serve in Europe, she said, "I'll take it," Bates recalled. What are your views on this video? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked our efforts in the research of the video, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss out on our content. Catch you in the next video.